I never thought that at 76 years old, after a lifetime of lecturing young men and women about the rise and fall of empires, about betrayals that tore apart kingdoms and families alike, I would find myself living out the same lessons in the quiet, worn silence of my own house. My name is Gerald Finch, and I was once a respected history professor at Ohio State, the kind of teacher who stayed late after class to answer the timid questions of shy students, who kept my office filled with dusty maps and annotated books, who believed, perhaps naively, that understanding the mistakes of the past could shield us from repeating them. I believed that right up until the day my wife died, and with her went the last vestige of warmth in the walls of our home. I am telling this story because sometimes, when a man has been stripped of dignity by those who should have been his closest, his own children, there is nothing left to do but speak, to carve truth into the silence where no one expected it to live. The mornings in my house arrive slowly now, the light crawling reluctantly across the wooden floorboards of a place that feels larger than it needs to be, each room filled with shadows that whisper her absence. Margaret was my companion for 47 years. She was a woman of sharp wit and careful gentleness, a woman who had an eye for details I would have overlooked. When she passed, a quiet December evening 5 years ago, I discovered how hollow the house sounded without her footsteps, how the ticking of the grandfather clock we had bought together echoed like a reminder that time was no longer ours, only mine. For a while, I tried to keep the routines alive. I made oatmeal the way she did, even though it never tasted the same. I left her armchair by the window untouched, a kind of shrine to a life that had meant everything to me. But as months became years, the rituals grew heavier. My days began to shrink into a rhythm of silence, a walk to the grocery store, an occasional conversation with a neighbor, long hours sitting at the kitchen table with newspapers I barely read. I tell you this not to elicit pity, but to explain the soil from which my hope grew when the phone finally rang one April morning, and I heard my daughter's voice, after months of nothing but absence. You see, when Margaret was alive, Lauren, our only child, would at least stop by for Sunday dinners, bringing her husband Matthew and the 2 grandchildren. It was never the warmest of visits, not like the stories Margaret would share about families who laughed together over casseroles, but there was a kind of rhythm in it, a sense that we were still part of each other's lives. After Margaret's death, those dinners ceased. The phone calls dwindled to polite check-ins, and then eventually to nothing at all. Birthdays passed unacknowledged. Holidays became days I spent alone, cooking a small roast for myself, watching from the window as neighbors' driveways filled with cars carrying children and grandchildren. I told myself that Lauren was busy with her career, that Matthew traveled often, that the grandchildren had their studies and their own young lives. But in truth, I knew I had been relegated to the edges, useful only when financial need arose. On more than one occasion, Lauren had phoned asking for money, for tuition, for car repairs, for the down payment on their house. I never refused, though each request left a residue of shame in me, a reminder that the man who once provided strength and wisdom had been reduced to a wallet reluctantly opened. So when, on that April morning, I lifted the receiver and heard Lauren say, "Dad, we're planning a family vacation in Hawaii, and we thought you might want to join us," my heart jolted like it had not in years. I nearly dropped the cup of coffee in my hand. So unfamiliar was the sound of her voice when it carried even a feigned warmth. She explained that they had reserved rooms at a fine hotel in Honolulu, that the children would be there, that it would be a chance for us all to spend time together. For a moment I forgot my age, forgot the stiffness in my knees, forgot the loneliness of the house that had begun to feel like a mausoleum. I imagined myself walking on the beach with my grandchildren, listening to the waves, perhaps telling them stories not from books, but from the long corridors of my own memory. I imagined laughter at dinners, a photograph taken with all of us together, the kind of photograph Margaret always longed for but rarely received. I said yes almost immediately, though my voice trembled with both excitement and disbelief. After we hung up, I sat in my chair staring at the receiver for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It seemed like an opening, a second chance to step back into the circle of my family, to prove that I was not a relic to be put away, but still a father, a grandfather, a man worth a place at their table. In the days that followed, I prepared with the meticulousness of someone who has too little left to anticipate. I went shopping for clothes, something I had not done in years, buying a light linen suit that I thought might look respectable in a coastal resort. I visited the barber, had my thinning hair trimmed neatly, even polished the pair of old leather shoes Margaret had once admired. At night, I lay awake rehearsing conversations with my grandchildren, wondering what books they read now, what hopes they carried for their futures. I prayed silently to Margaret, telling her that maybe this was the bridge she had wanted me to build, that perhaps she had intervened from beyond, to give me one last chance at belonging. And yet, beneath the layers of hope, there was unease. Lauren's voice during that call had been too careful, her words too rehearsed. She had provided details with a precision that sounded less like warmth and more like instruction. What to pack, what not to bring, what documents I should carry. She insisted I need not worry about booking anything, that she and Matthew had arranged everything. For a fleeting moment, suspicion pierced the haze of joy, but I forced it down. Suspicion had become my reflex in recent years, a guard against disappointments that seemed to multiply with age, but I refused to let it poison this chance. I told myself that I was being cynical, that age had made me mistrustful, and that surely no daughter would go to the trouble of inviting her father across an ocean only to cause him harm. As the date approached, I moved with a sense of urgency, unfamiliar to my body. I cleaned the house, not because anyone would visit in my absence, but because Margaret had always said you should never leave a place in disarray, as though order preserved dignity. I packed and repacked, counting the pills I needed for my blood pressure, tucking away an envelope with a modest sum of cash, just in case. Each small act of preparation carried the weight of ritual, as if by doing everything correctly I could ensure that nothing would go wrong. I even went so far as to polish the old wristwatch Margaret had given me on our 30th anniversary, a watch I had not worn in years. I wanted to look, in every possible way, like a man who still belonged in the world of his family. On the morning of my flight, I awoke before dawn. The house was still, the air heavy with silence, but in me stirred an excitement I had not felt since the days when Margaret and I would take the train to Chicago for summer getaways. As I locked the door behind me and stepped into the cool air, suitcase in hand, I whispered a promise to Margaret that I would do everything I could to bring our family together again, that this trip would not be wasted. The taxi pulled away from the curb, and through the back window I watched the outline of my house shrink into the distance. It struck me then, almost like an omen, that I might never return to that house the same man I was when I left. I arrived at the airport hours before departure, unwilling to risk anything that might derail this fragile hope. As I sat at the gate watching families gather with their laughter, I felt a pang of longing so sharp it nearly drew tears. I told myself that soon I too would be among such scenes, that soon my daughter would look at me not as an obligation, but as her father. I boarded the plane with my heart full, clutching a photograph of Margaret tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket. I whispered to her memory that this time would be different, that I would not be humiliated again, that surely, finally, the wheel of fortune had turned back in my favor. The descent into Honolulu was breathtaking in a way that should have been pure joy, but already I felt a strange current tugging beneath the surface of my excitement. Through the small oval window, I could see the jagged mountains rising against the horizon, their green ridges spilling into the turquoise waters of the Pacific. Tourists around me pressed their phones to the glass, laughing and gasping, and for a moment I joined in their awe, letting the beauty of the island wash over me. I told myself that this was a new chapter, that the fatigue of travel and the nerves gathering in my chest were simply the byproducts of an old man venturing too far from his routines. After all, I had crossed the continent to be here, to meet my daughter and her family on what might be the last great adventure of my life. Surely nothing could diminish the promise of reconciliation waiting just beyond the airport gates. The terminal buzzed with life, the air thick with scents of salt water and flowers, the rhythmic sound of Hawaiian music floating from hidden speakers. I retrieved my modest suitcase from the carousel and walked slowly toward the arrivals hall, my heart thumping with both anticipation and unease. I had imagined this moment countless times during the flight. Lauren's smile, Matthew's polite handshake, perhaps the grandchildren running toward me with the clumsy enthusiasm of youth. Instead, I was met with nothing. The crowd surged around me, families greeting one another with laughter and embraces. But my daughter was nowhere to be seen. I lingered near the exit, checked my watch, and reminded myself that flights rarely align perfectly with schedules. They might be delayed in traffic, I told myself, or perhaps waiting just outside. After half an hour of standing in the streaming crowd, I dialed Lauren's number. No answer. I tried again, then sent a message. Still nothing. A seed of doubt pressed itself into my thoughts, but I pushed it down, wheeled my suitcase outside, and hailed a cab. The hotel name had been etched in my mind for weeks. Lauren had repeated it to me several times, insisting that all arrangements were handled. The ride from the airport carried me along palm-lined roads, past the gleaming ocean that seemed to shimmer with the promise of a life I had never known. The driver was cheerful, pointing out landmarks, but I barely heard him. I rehearsed once again the words I would say upon seeing them, how I would thank Lauren for thinking of me, how I would tell the grandchildren about their grandmother's love for the sea. I clutched the armrest, as though holding myself steady against the tremor of both excitement and dread. When the cab finally pulled into the circular driveway of the hotel, I felt a surge of awe. The building rose with elegant white walls, framed by tall palms swaying in the breeze, a fountain splashing in the center of the courtyard where families posed for photographs. I stepped out of the cab, adjusted my jacket, and inhaled deeply, readying myself. Inside, the lobby glowed with polished marble and chandeliers, the kind of place that whispered wealth and belonging. My heart swelled with the thought that Lauren had included me in such a grand plan, that perhaps this was her way of finally bridging the chasm between us. I approached the reception desk, set down my suitcase, and gave my name with quiet pride. The young man at the desk, dressed immaculately in a navy blazer, tapped at his computer. His brow furrowed slightly, and he typed again. He looked up at me with professional politeness, but his words struck me with the weight of a hammer. "I'm sorry, sir. Your name is not on the guest list." I blinked, certain I had misheard. "Perhaps you should check again," I said, my voice careful, almost apologetic, as though I were the one in error. My daughter, Lauren Finch, should have made the reservation. She said my room was arranged under her family's booking. He searched again, then shook his head. The Finch party checked in yesterday, sir. Their reservation includes 2 adults and 2 children. I'm afraid there is no additional guest registered. The words hung in the air like a sentence. Behind me the lobby pulsed with movement, laughter, footsteps, the roll of luggage wheels. But in my ears there was only a hollow ringing. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands gripping the handle of my suitcase, as though it were the only thing tethering me to the earth. That must be a mistake, I insisted, my voice trembling. She told me everything was arranged. The concierge offered a practiced smile, the kind that conceals discomfort. I'm sorry, sir. If you'd like, we can check for availability under your own name, but I must inform you that our rooms are fully booked for the week. I stood frozen, unable to respond. Guests moved past me with room keys and leis around their necks, children skipping happily to the elevators. I, meanwhile, was rooted at the desk like a man turned to stone, confronted with the realization that I had not been welcomed, but deliberately excluded. For a fleeting second, I wanted to believe that Lauren had made an error, that she had simply forgotten to add my name. But the more likely explanation pressed against my chest like a vice. She had never intended for me to stay. With trembling hands, I stepped aside, allowing the next guest to approach the desk. I fumbled with my phone, dialing Lauren again. This time she answered, her voice clipped and rushed, as though she had been expecting my call, but dreaded its arrival. "Dad? What's wrong?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I'm at the hotel. They told me I'm not on the reservation. They said you checked in yesterday." There was a pause, a silence, in which I could almost hear her exhale in irritation. "Dad, listen," she began, her tone suddenly sharp. "We didn't mean for you to fly all the way here just to stay with us. The kids have a packed schedule. Matthew and I are busy, and we thought it might be easier if you explored on your own. You're independent, aren't you? You could find a little inn nearby, enjoy the sights, the history, the museums. This way you won't feel constrained by our plans." Her words struck with a precision that made me stagger. It was not an accident, not a miscommunication, but a choice. She had invited me across the ocean not to be with them, but to place me at the periphery, to keep me close enough for conscience, but distant enough to be invisible. I felt my knees weaken, the polished marble floor tilting beneath me. "Lauren," I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts, "I flew here because you asked me to. I thought this was a family trip. I thought you wanted me here." She sighed, the sound of exasperation rather than compassion. "Dad, don't make this into something it isn't. You always get so emotional. We thought you'd enjoy the change of scenery, that's all. Please don't create a scene at the hotel. We'll meet for dinner one evening, maybe. But right now we're heading out on an excursion. I have to go." And with that, the line went dead. I remained standing in the lobby, phone limp in my hand, while the world carried on around me. Tourists checked in with smiles. Luggage carts rolled past. Staff bowed politely to arriving guests. To them, I was invisible. Just another old man out of place, a relic who had wandered too far from where he belonged. I felt humiliation flood me, not the sharp humiliation of a single insult, but the deeper, more corrosive kind that seeps into a man's bones when he realizes he has been deliberately erased from the circle he once called family. My chest ached with both sorrow and disbelief, and for the first time in years, I longed for Margaret so fiercely that I nearly whispered her name aloud, as though she might walk through the doors and take my arm. I turned slowly, dragging my suitcase behind me, and walked out into the glaring sunlight of the courtyard. The fountain splashed merrily. Children laughed. cameras clicked, and I felt as though I had been cast in the role of a ghost, haunting a place where he no longer belonged. Somewhere within those gleaming walls, my daughter and her family were preparing for another day of leisure. And I, her father, the man who had once carried her on his shoulders, who had paid her way through college, who had stood by her through every storm, had been written out of the script. The invitation had been nothing but a mirage, a cruel trick of hope. And as I stepped out onto the busy street, I realized that my journey was only beginning, though it was not the one I had imagined. The heat outside the hotel pressed against me like a second skin, the kind that makes even the strongest man feel suddenly fragile. I walked aimlessly at first, pulling my suitcase along the uneven pavement, trying to steady my thoughts as the laughter and chatter of strangers washed over me. Every step felt heavier, not because of my age, though my knees ached as they always did, but because of the weight of humiliation that clung to me after the words of my daughter. It was one thing to be forgotten, overlooked in the busyness of life, but to be brought here, across an ocean, only to be deliberately excluded. It struck at a place so deep inside me, I hardly knew how to contain it. My mind circled back again and again to the image of Lauren at the check-in desk, smiling politely as if she were with any ordinary guest, pretending not to see me while her husband and children stood by, her hand on the key cards, mine on the suitcase. I found myself at a shaded bench across from the hotel entrance, the roar of the fountain muffled by distance, and I sat there for a long time, trying to summon the strength to decide what to do next. Around me, tourists carried shopping bags, couples strolled arm in arm, and the occasional cab honked in the chaos of traffic. To anyone watching, I must have looked like another weary traveler pausing before moving on, but inside I was unraveling. I wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misstep in communication, but Lauren's voice still echoed in my ear, so sharp, so final, so calculated in its dismissal. Eventually, with the sun sinking higher and my body demanding relief, I dragged myself to a smaller inn a few blocks away. It was nothing like the hotel, no grand lobby or fountains, just a simple reception desk, faded carpet, and the faint smell of cleaning chemicals. The woman behind the counter gave me a room for a single night, her eyes lingering on me with a kindness I hadn't expected. Perhaps she saw something in my face, a story she didn't ask to hear. I carried my suitcase upstairs to a small room with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the alley. It wasn't much, but it was a place to sit down, to breathe, to make sense of what had just happened. I tried calling Lauren again that evening, though I knew what the answer would be, straight to voicemail. I left a message anyway, speaking slowly, carefully, because some part of me still clung to the hope that if I was patient, if I spoke with reason and calm, she might change her mind. "Lauren," I said, my voice catching in my throat, "I'm here in Honolulu. I thought this was supposed to be a family trip. I don't understand why I'm not included. Please call me back. Please." I hung up and sat in silence, staring at the cheap painting on the wall of my room, listening to the hum of the old air conditioner. I told myself she would respond, but the truth was already clear. My presence was not wanted, not in the hotel, not in their plans, not even in their sense of what family meant. The next day I tried to distract myself by walking through the streets of Waikiki. Tourists filled the sidewalks, vendors sold lace and souvenirs, and the ocean stretched endlessly at the end of every street, glittering beneath the sun. I should have been enchanted, but I moved through it like a man half asleep, the sounds and colors washing over me without sinking in. I bought a small sandwich from a stand and ate it on a bench by the beach, watching children run laughing into the waves. Their joy cut me sharper than any blade, because I could not stop imagining my own grandchildren somewhere nearby, perhaps at this very beach, laughing with their parents, while I sat alone only a few streets away, forbidden from joining. In the afternoon, I decided to try once more, clinging to a shred of hope. I returned to the hotel, clutching my phone in my hand, rehearsing in my mind what I might say if I saw them. My heart pounded as I walked into the lobby again, the same marble floor, the same fountain outside. I asked the concierge if perhaps he could call up to the Finch room, explain that their father was waiting. He shook his head politely, repeating that he was not authorized to disturb guests at the request of outsiders. Outsiders, the word seared through me, though he had not meant it with malice. I was an outsider now, not the father who had raised her, not the grandfather who had once bounced her children on his knee, but a man removed from the list as though he had never belonged. It was as I stood there in that humiliating moment that I saw them. Lauren appeared in the lobby with Matthew by her side, both dressed casually for a day out, sunglasses perched on their heads, smiles on their faces that faltered when their eyes landed on me. Behind them trailed the grandchildren, taller than I remembered, carrying beach towels and bags. For an instant, time folded back on itself. I saw Lauren as a child again, clutching Margaret's hand, her hair in braids, her face lit with the uncomplicated trust of youth. But the woman before me now was not that child, and her eyes held no trust, no affection, only irritation. "Dad," she said quickly, as though cutting me off before I could speak, "what are you doing here?" "I came to see you," I replied, my voice breaking against the tide of emotion. "You invited me. You asked me to join you. I thought we would be together." Her husband shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight, his hand pressing lightly on her arm as if to keep her from saying too much. The grandchildren looked at me with something I could not read. Confusion, embarrassment, maybe even pity. I wanted to reach out, to say their names, but the air between us was so taut with unspoken rejection that I could not move. Lauren sighed, lowering her voice though her words carried like knives. "Dad, we talked about this. You can't just show up like this. We already have plans. It's not fair to the kids. It's not fair to us." "Not fair?" I repeated, my voice louder now, drawing glances from others in the lobby. "I crossed an ocean because you asked me to. I thought this was a family vacation." Her face hardened, a mask of control. "Please don't make a scene. We'll talk later. Maybe we can meet for dinner, just the two of us. But right now you need to let us go. We're already late." And with that, she turned, shepherding her family toward the waiting shuttle outside. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as my daughter walked away from me with quick, decisive steps, her husband and children following, as though I were no more than a stranger who had approached them uninvited. The humiliation was complete. To be dismissed once was cruelty. To be dismissed in full view of strangers, in front of her own children, was annihilation. I felt the eyes of the concierge on me, the sympathy he could not voice, and I wanted the ground to open beneath me and swallow me whole. My body shook as I reached for my suitcase and turned away, stumbling out into the sunlight, my vision blurred by tears I had not meant to shed in public. That evening, alone again in my small room, I thought of Margaret. I spoke to her in the dark, whispering into the empty air. "I don't know what I did wrong," I told her. "I don't know why she treats me this way. I gave her everything I had, and now I'm nothing to her." The room offered no answer, only the dull hum of the air conditioner and the distant noise of laughter from the street below. It was then that the fear began to creep in, deeper than humiliation, more insidious than anger. For the first time, I began to wonder if Lauren had not only excluded me, but planned it deliberately. The careful instructions, the insistence that I bring my documents, the detail with which she had told me what to pack, it no longer sounded like care, but like calculation. Perhaps she had wanted me far from home, isolated, dependent, easier to control. The thought lodged itself like a splinter in my mind, and no matter how I turned it, I could not remove it. The next day I woke early, though sleep had been a stranger to me through most of the night, and I sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the small inn staring at the suitcase at my feet, as if it could provide an answer to the gnawing questions that had been multiplying inside me. I felt both foolish and angry, embarrassed by the memory of the lobby where my daughter had looked through me as though I were no more than a nuisance, yet also unsettled by something darker, a suspicion that her cruelty was not only casual neglect, but intentional design. I had carried those thoughts with me through the night, turning them over until they grew sharper and more dangerous. Why had she insisted I bring my passport, my credit cards, my documents? Why had she spoken with such precision, as though she were setting the conditions of an arrangement rather than inviting me as her father? I tried to dismiss these ideas as paranoia, the twisted imaginings of a lonely old man. But the more I replayed her words, the more I felt certain that beneath the rejection was something deliberate, some scheme in which I had unwittingly become a pawn. Driven by a need to see the truth with my own eyes, I returned once more to the Grand Hotel. I told myself I would not cause a scene, that I only wanted to look upon my family as they went about their day, to confirm whether my fears were real or simply the product of grief and humiliation. I sat on a bench across the street, half hidden by a row of palms, and watched as the shuttle pulled up to the entrance. A few minutes later, Lauren and Matthew emerged with the children, dressed for an excursion, their faces bright with the careless joy of those whose lives have no shadow. I studied them as though from a great distance, though only a few meters separated us. And what struck me most was not their beauty or their laughter, but the ease with which I was absent from their world, the way their movements and conversations flowed as if I had never existed. It was then that a voice startled me from behind. "Grandpa!" I turned, and there stood Justin, my daughter's son from her first marriage, taller than when I had last seen him, with the beginnings of a beard on his chin and an expression of confusion mixed with guilt. He looked at me as though he had stumbled upon a secret he had not been meant to discover. I stood slowly, my heart pounding, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "I didn't know you were here. Mom told us you couldn't make the trip, that you had canceled at the last minute." His words struck like lightning, illuminating everything I had feared. She had not only excluded me, but lied to her own children, crafting a story in which I was the one who had withdrawn, the one who had failed them, erasing her own betrayal by painting me as unreliable. My throat tightened, and I placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying myself. "No, Justin," I whispered. "I didn't cancel. I was invited. I flew here because your mother asked me to. And now I find myself without a place, without a room, without even acknowledgement that I exist." His eyes widened, the guilt deepening. He looked back toward the hotel where the shuttle waited, his mother and stepfather already climbing aboard with his younger sister, and then turned back to me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. She told us you weren't coming. She said you were too tired for travel." He hesitated, then added, She didn't want me to ask questions. For a moment, the world tilted. The fountain splashed. Cars honked in the street. Tourists laughed as they passed. But in my ears there was only the sound of my grandson's voice, the fragile truth slipping out despite the walls his mother had built. I wanted to embrace him, to tell him that his apology was more than enough, but I also knew that lingering would only draw suspicion. Already Lauren was calling from the shuttle, her voice sharp across the courtyard. Justin glanced nervously in her direction, then back at me, and for a brief second his eyes met mine with an expression I had not seen in years. Recognition, compassion, and something close to love. Then he turned and hurried across the street, climbing into the shuttle as though nothing had happened. I remained standing there, the knowledge settling like a stone in my chest. It was true then. I had not been mistaken or paranoid. My daughter had lied not only to me, but to her own children, deliberately crafting a version of reality in which I had excluded myself, leaving her blameless. It was a manipulation so cold that I could barely comprehend it, and yet it explained everything. The strange insistence on details, the careful instructions, the absence of my name on the reservation. She had not wanted me here as family. She had wanted me here as evidence, perhaps, of my supposed frailty, my confusion, something she could point to later when it suited her. I walked slowly back to the inn, the heat of the sun pressing down on me, though it was nothing compared to the heat of rage that had begun to burn inside. By the time I reached my room, I was trembling, not only with anger, but with a new kind of clarity. This was not simply about neglect or carelessness. This was about erasure, about being written out of the story altogether. And if she could lie so easily to her own children, then what else was she capable of lying about? I sat at the small desk in my room, pulled out the envelope of cash I had brought, and counted it carefully. I checked my wallet, my passport, the credit cards tucked inside. For the first time in years, I felt a wave of suspicion, not just toward her words, but toward her intentions. Had she brought me here to leave me stranded, to take from me what little remained? I shuddered at the thought, but I could not dismiss it. That night, as darkness settled over Honolulu, I opened the drawer of the bedside table and found a pad of hotel stationery. I began to write, not to Lauren, but to Margaret, as I often did in my loneliest hours. "My dearest," I wrote, "I think our daughter is not the child we once believed her to be. She has deceived me. She has deceived even her own children. And I fear there is more to this than I can see. If you were here, you would tell me to be strong, to keep my dignity. But I confess I feel it slipping away. I wish you could tell me whether I am imagining things, whether grief and age have clouded my judgment, or whether I am truly seeing the cruelty in her eyes for the first time." The words blurred as tears filled my vision, and I set the pen down, pressing my hands together as though in prayer. The midpoint of my journey had arrived, though I did not yet know it. What had begun as a trip of hope, a fragile chance to reclaim the place of father and grandfather, had turned into a revelation of betrayal more profound than any I had prepared myself to endure. And as I lay down that night, the sound of waves in the distance, I realized that the days ahead would not be about reunion, but about survival. Not about finding my family again, but about finding out what a man becomes when his own blood seeks to erase him. The days that followed became a blur of walking streets that were not mine, sitting in cafes where no one knew my name, and watching the sea that seemed to mock me with its endless horizon, as if to remind me how far I had come, only to find myself cast out. At first, I tried to hold on to hope, telling myself that perhaps Lauren would call, perhaps she would soften, Perhaps my presence here was still salvageable. But with each passing hour, the silence from her grew louder, more deliberate, until it seemed to drown out even the sounds of the city. I checked my phone obsessively, each vibration sending a jolt through me, only to find it was never her. The humiliation of that first day had been sharp and immediate, but what came after was slower, a gnawing erosion of dignity that left me hollowed out. On the third day of my exile, I decided to walk past the hotel again, not because I wanted another confrontation, but because I could not keep myself from looking at the place where my family resided while I was left adrift. From across the street, I watched as Lauren and Matthew emerged, their arms full of shopping bags, their laughter carrying across the traffic. They looked like any other couple on vacation, carefree and content, untouched by the knowledge that only a few steps away, their father stood watching, aching for acknowledgement. The grandchildren trailed behind, speaking to each other, one of them pointing toward the ocean with excitement. I longed to call their names, but the memory of the lobby silenced me. To be ignored once more, especially in front of strangers, was a humiliation I could not bear again. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. Matthew handed Lauren his phone, and she glanced at it quickly before looking around as though checking if anyone might be watching. Then she tucked it into her bag, her expression briefly shifting from carefree to calculating. It was only a moment, but it struck me. Later that evening, back in my room at the inn, I replayed the image in my mind. The quick exchange, the glance over her shoulder, the tightening of her mouth. It was the expression of someone not merely enjoying a vacation, but managing a scheme, concealing something from sight. The following morning, I woke to find that my wallet had been disturbed. I had placed it carefully beneath the pillow before falling asleep, a habit I had carried with me from years of travel in less secure places. But now the cash seemed to have shifted. My hands shook as I counted it, and though all the bills appeared to be present, I could not shake the feeling that someone had been through my things. I searched the room thoroughly, opening drawers and checking the lock on the door, and though I found nothing, the unease settled deeper into my bones. When I opened my suitcase to retrieve a shirt, I discovered that my passport, which I had tucked carefully into the inner pocket, was no longer where I had placed it. After frantic searching, I found it buried under folded clothes, as though it had been moved deliberately. Panic clawed at me. Someone had entered the room while I slept. Someone had touched my documents. That was when I began to realize the full scope of what might be happening. Lauren had insisted I bring everything: passport, credit cards, identification, though the trip was domestic and would have required none of it. She had spoken with such precision about what I must pack, as though ensuring that all the necessary pieces were in place. And now those very items had been disturbed in ways I could not explain. My mind leapt to dark possibilities. Identity theft, financial manipulation, even abandonment designed to leave me stranded without resources. The thought that my own daughter could orchestrate such a thing was almost too terrible to believe. Yet the evidence of my disturbed belongings, combined with her cold rejection and lies to her children, made it impossible to ignore. The fear that I had once dismissed as paranoia began to solidify into certainty. I decided then that I would no longer wait passively. I needed answers. That afternoon, summoning what remained of my dignity, I returned to the hotel one last time. I told myself that if Lauren refused to acknowledge me again, I would at least confront her openly, demand the truth in front of her family. As I approached the lobby, my chest tightened with both dread and determination. But when I arrived, I discovered they were not there. The concierge told me politely that the Finch family had left early that morning for a private excursion and would not return until late evening. The way he said it, the rehearsed tone of courtesy, carried an undertone I could not ignore. They had anticipated my arrival. They had made sure they were absent. I wandered the streets aimlessly, lost in thought, until evening fell. By then exhaustion had driven me back to my room, where I collapsed into the chair by the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, and I sat in the half-darkness with only my thoughts for company. It was then that the phone in my pocket vibrated. For a fleeting moment my heart soared, thinking it might be Lauren at last. But when I pulled it out, I saw it was a bank alert. My credit card had been used to withdraw $5,000 at an ATM not far from the hotel. My hands went cold, my breath caught in my throat. I had not used the card since arriving. It had been in my wallet the entire time. Yet here was proof that someone had taken it, used it, and returned it without my noticing. I called the bank immediately, reporting the transaction. But even as I spoke to the representative, I felt a wave of despair. If they had access to my card once, they could have it again. If they had moved my passport, what else might they attempt? I asked the bank to block the card, to issue a replacement, but the logistics of receiving a new one while I was here felt impossible. I was a man in a foreign city, far from home, with limited cash, and a growing certainty that my own daughter was behind the theft. That night I could not sleep. I paced the room, staring at the suitcase, imagining Lauren and Matthew laughing in their suite, while planning what more they might take from me. At one point I sat down and began to write a letter to myself, a kind of testament, recording everything that had happened in case I never made it home. If anyone finds this, I wrote, know that I did not come here of my own confusion. I was invited, I was brought, and I was betrayed. The words felt dramatic, even as I wrote them, but they also felt necessary. I had lived long enough to know how easily the stories of old men are twisted, how quickly they are dismissed as ramblings of a failing mind. The next morning brought a new kind of devastation. I went down to the inn's small dining area for breakfast, and when I returned to my room I found a note slipped under the door. The handwriting was unmistakable, Lauren's. It read simply, "Dad, please stop causing trouble. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Stay out of our way. We'll sort things out when we're back home. Don't do anything rash." My hand trembled as I read it again and again, each line burning deeper into me. There was no warmth, no apology, no explanation, only a command, as though I were a problem to be managed rather than a father to be loved. I sank into the chair and stared at the note, my anger mounting with every breath. What did she mean by harder than it needs to be? Harder for whom? For her? For Matthew? Certainly not for me, who had already been discarded. And what would be sorted out back home? My finances, my independence, my very identity? The words were vague, but the implication was chilling. She was planning something, and she did not care if I suspected it. In fact, the note read as though she assumed I would remain powerless, too broken to resist. By evening, my despair had transformed into a fierce resolve. I realized that if I stayed here passively, if I continued to wait for her to dictate the terms of my existence, I would end up erased entirely. I had already been lied about, already been stripped of dignity, already been left out of the family narrative. If I did not act now, I would lose everything else too. My savings, my autonomy, perhaps even my place in the world. That was the night I made a decision. I would return home on my own terms, without her assistance, without her permission. And when I did, I would take back control of my life from the very daughter who had sought to take it from me. But before I could leave, I needed to confirm one final truth. I resolved to see them once more, not from afar, not through stolen glimpses, but directly, so I could look into her eyes and know beyond doubt whether she was the daughter I had raised or a stranger wearing her face. And so I planned carefully. I learned from the concierge that the family had booked a dinner reservation at a well-known restaurant overlooking the ocean. The next evening, dressed in my best clothes, I arrived there before they did, requesting a table in the corner where I could watch without being noticed. When they arrived, laughing and radiant, I studied them as though they were characters in a play. Lauren looked beautiful, her hair shining in the soft light, her smile wide and effortless. Matthew leaned close to her, whispering something that made her laugh. The grandchildren scrolled on their phones, oblivious. It might have been an ordinary family dinner, except for the knowledge that I, their father and grandfather, sat only a few feet away, invisible, erased. The sight filled me with both sorrow and fury, but also clarity. There was no mistake, no misunderstanding. She had made her choice. She had constructed a world in which I did not exist, and she was content to live in it. Watching her in that moment, I knew with certainty that I could never return to the old life of waiting by the phone, hoping for scraps of acknowledgement. Something inside me hardened. My story was not over, but hers, at least the part of it that included me, was finished. The night of the yacht excursion arrived with a kind of inevitability, as though every humiliation and revelation of the past week had been pushing me toward this single moment. I had learned of the event 2 days earlier, overhearing a pair of tourists in the hotel lobby mention a private cruise that catered to families staying in the suites. When I asked casually if the Finch family had booked a place, the concierge, perhaps unaware of the strained truth between us, confirmed with a polite nod. That was when the idea formed in my mind, at first like a dangerous whisper I dared not repeat, and then slowly with the solidity of resolve. If I could not reclaim my place by invitation, then I would claim it by presence, forcing her to look at me, forcing her children to see me not as the ghost she had painted, but as the man who had raised her, who still lived, who still demanded to be seen. I spent what little money I had left to purchase my own ticket for the cruise, a price so steep I knew it meant I would return home nearly penniless. But it felt less like a purchase and more like a final gamble, a stake in the game of dignity I was determined to win, even if it was the last hand I would ever play. That afternoon I dressed carefully in the linen suit I had bought before leaving Ohio, the one that still carried faint traces of hope in its folds. I polished my shoes until they caught the light, adjusted the old watch Margaret had given me, and looked at myself in the mirror. The man staring back was aged, worn, his skin mapped with the creases of years. But his eyes still held fire, and for the first time since Margaret's death, I saw not just a shadow of who I had been, but a man prepared to fight for himself. The dock was crowded with tourists when I arrived, but I kept to myself, boarding quietly and taking a seat near the stern. The evening sun painted the sky with shades of gold and crimson, and the water sparkled like broken glass. As the yacht began to move, a murmur rose among the guests, laughter mixing with the sound of waves, the clink of glasses, the strains of soft music drifting through the warm air. And then I saw them. Lauren, Matthew, and the children appeared at the far end of the deck, radiant in their holiday clothes, their skin bronzed by days of sun, their faces alight with joy. For a moment, I simply watched them, allowing myself the luxury of imagining that I was there by right, that I belonged, that Margaret was beside me smiling at the sight of her grandchildren. But the fantasy could not hold. They had not noticed me yet, and I knew that if I allowed the night to pass in silence, I would leave as invisible as I had arrived. My heart pounded as I rose slowly to my feet, walking across the deck with measured steps, each one heavier than the last. Conversations quieted as I approached, a few heads turning to watch. And then Lauren saw me. Her smile froze, her face tightening with shock that quickly hardened into fury. "Dad," she hissed under her breath, stepping forward to block me. "What are you doing here? You can't just show up like this." I stood tall, forcing my voice to remain steady though my hands trembled. "I am not a ghost, Lauren. I am your father. I was invited to this trip. I crossed an ocean because you asked me to. And yet you erased me, lied to your children, left me to wander alone in a strange city. Tonight I will not be erased. Tonight you will look at me." Her husband shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the other guests who were now watching openly. The children stared, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. Justin's eyes, especially, were fixed on me with a kind of silent plea, as if willing me to continue. Lauren's voice was sharp, dripping with contempt. "You're embarrassing yourself. And us. This is exactly why I didn't want you here. You create scenes. You make everything about you." Her words sliced through me, but instead of silencing me, they fueled something deeper. I raised my voice, not with the wildness of rage, but with the measured cadence of a man who had spent his life lecturing halls of students, a man who knew how to command attention. "Everything about me?" I repeated, my voice carrying across the deck. "I gave you everything I had, Lauren. I worked 2 jobs to send you to college. I paid the down payment on your house when you couldn't manage it. I sat by your side when your first marriage fell apart. Everything I did was for you. And now, in the winter of my life, you decide I am nothing more than an inconvenience, an embarrassment to be hidden from sight. You tell your children I canceled, that I was too frail, when the truth is, you cast me aside." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Lauren flushed crimson, her jaw tight, her hands clenched at her sides. Matthew reached for her arm, whispering something I could not hear, but she shook him off, her eyes blazing at me. "You don't understand, Dad. You were never easy. Mom made excuses for you, but I lived with it. You were always lecturing, always making everything dramatic. I didn't want to spend this vacation managing you like another child. You were supposed to stay out of the way." The cruelty of her words struck me like a blow, but I did not flinch. I took a step closer, my voice quieter now, but no less steady. "I was never perfect, but I was your father, and you were my daughter. Whatever I failed at, it was not love. That I gave without measure. If you cannot see that, then you are not only cruel, you are lost." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the sound of waves against the hull. The other guests looked away awkwardly, some whispering, some staring at Lauren with disapproval. But what mattered most to me were the eyes of my grandchildren. They looked at me not with shame, but with something closer to recognition, as if the spell of their mother's lies had been broken in that moment. I straightened my shoulders, the weight of years pressing down, but not breaking me. "I will not beg for a place at your table any more," I said, my voice carrying with finality. "I will not wait by the phone, or send money, or pretend that indifference is love. If you wish to erase me, then know this. I will go willingly from your story. But do not think you can erase the truth. Your children will know who I was. They will know that I stood here tonight, not as a ghost, but as their grandfather, a man who deserved better." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing rigid with fury, Matthew pale beside her, and the children silent but wide-eyed. I did not look back. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, I felt something close to liberation. As though by speaking the words aloud, I had unchained myself from the weight of hope that had bound me. The yacht sailed on, but I stood at the far end of the deck, the wind cool against my face, the city lights twinkling in the distance. I knew I would leave Honolulu soon, but I would not leave defeated. I had confronted her lies, spoken the truth before witnesses, and reclaimed the dignity she had tried to strip from me. Whatever came next, I was no longer waiting for permission to exist. The morning after the yacht excursion, I woke with a heaviness in my body that was not merely the fatigue of age or the toll of travel, but the deep exhaustion of a man who had finally released something he had carried for far too long. The confrontation with Lauren had drained me, yet in its aftermath I felt an unfamiliar stillness, a sense of clarity I had not known in years. For the first time since Margaret's death, I was no longer waiting for my daughter to choose me, no longer measuring my worth against her attention or approval. I had spoken the truth aloud, not only to her, but to her children and to strangers who would remember the scene. And in doing so, I had reclaimed something she could never again take away: my dignity. I packed my suitcase slowly, folding the linen suit with care, placing Margaret's photograph back into the inner pocket of my jacket. The note Lauren had slipped under my door still lay on the desk, and for a moment I considered tearing it to pieces, scattering the fragments out the window into the breeze. But then I thought better of it. I tucked it into the envelope with the letter I had written to Margaret as proof, not for myself, but perhaps for Justin one day, that everything I endured here was real, that I had not imagined it, that I had been wronged, but had chosen to face it with words rather than silence. At the airport, I moved slowly through the crowds, an old man among families hurrying to catch flights, business travelers rushing with briefcases, young couples leaning into each other's shoulders. No one knew my story, yet I carried it with me like a quiet fire, not with shame, but with resolve. On the plane, I stared out the window as the island receded into the horizon, the mountains shrinking into shadows against the sea, and I whispered goodbye to the place that had nearly broken me, but had instead given me the final piece of truth I needed. Back in Ohio, the house greeted me with its silence, the air heavy with the absence of Margaret. But something had shifted. I no longer walked through those rooms as a man waiting for a phone call that would never come. Instead, I began to imagine a life beyond that waiting. Within weeks, I put the house up for sale, a decision that startled even me with its decisiveness. I packed boxes of books, donated clothes, and set aside the few objects that carried Margaret's memory most strongly: her knitting basket, her favorite chair, a stack of letters she had written me in the early years of our marriage. The rest I let go, because I had come to understand that clinging to the shells of the past had only kept me tethered to an expectation that no longer served me. I moved to a small town by a lake, a quiet place where the mornings smelled of pine and the evenings were painted with the reflection of sunsets on the water. My new home was modest, just a small cottage with a porch that creaked when I stepped onto it, but it felt like freedom. The neighbors were kind, greeting me with nods and small conversations, and though I did not yet know their names, I knew already that I belonged more among these strangers than I had in the company of my own blood. In the mornings I took walks along the water, nodding to fishermen casting their lines, watching the ducks skim across the surface. In the afternoons I sat on the porch with a book, sometimes reading, sometimes only listening to the wind in the trees. I wrote to Justin, sending him a letter with photographs of his grandmother, along with a copy of the will I had rewritten. In it I left what little I had to him. not as a gesture of revenge against Lauren, but as a gift to the only one who had looked at me with honesty, the only one who had dared to speak the truth. I do not know if he will ever understand fully, but perhaps one day, when he is older, he will read my words and know that his grandfather loved him enough to defy erasure. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself breathing easier, no longer haunted by the silence of an unanswered phone. I no longer sat by the window waiting for headlights in the driveway that never came. Instead, I filled my evenings with the company of my own thoughts, the quiet companionship of Margaret's memory, and the gentle rhythm of a life lived on my own terms. It was not the life I had imagined in my youth, not the family circle I had once longed for, but it was honest, and it was mine. Sometimes, as the sun sets over the lake, and the sky burns with colors that remind me of that night on the yacht, I think of Lauren. I wonder if she ever tells the story of what happened in Honolulu, whether she paints me as the villain, the embarrassing old man who disrupted her vacation. Perhaps she does. Perhaps she believes it. But it no longer matters. I have learned that the truth does not vanish simply because someone denies it. The truth lives in memory, in the eyes of grandchildren, in the quiet dignity of a man who refused to be erased. And so I sit on my porch, the cool air brushing against my skin, and I feel, for the first time in years, a kind of peace. Not the peace of reconciliation, but the peace of release. My life is no longer in her hands, no longer defined by her neglect or her cruelty. It belongs to me again. And as I watch the last light fade from the sky, I whisper to Margaret that I am finally free.